All right, hey Cougars, this is Unit 1, Lecture 5, and it's pages 13, 14, and 15, all right? Today we continue on with this huge concept of federalism, all right? Remember, federalism is the constitutional division of power between the states and the national government, all right? The sharing of power, and it's the idea, don't forget that the framers believed that it could address a lot of the problems. The problems of if you have a confederate system, power is absolutely at the state level and the federal government is too weak. If you have a unitary system like the British did under the monarchy, you have a central government that is incredibly powerful and the states have no power at all. And so federalism is the idea behind that balance, all right? But giving the states some power, giving the federal government power, and ideally striking some balance, all right? And again, but the definition of appropriate federalism depends upon the person, depends upon the times. We will consistently kind of debate what's a state right, what's a federal right, all right? So one thing I want to go back to, though, on page 12 of the last time, is you'll notice on page 12 in Roman numeral 1 and 2, you had the decentralists and the centralists. All decentralists mean is this idea is that they want power spread out to the states more than to the national government. And a centralist wants more power to the federal government than to the states, or at least believes that the federal government should have some power or a lot of power, all right? They both are federalism, believe in federalism, the idea of sharing of power, but the decentralists believe that the states, because they're closer to the people and a variety of other reasons, should have more power, and then vice versa for the centralists, all right? But if you look at in each of the decentralists and the centralists, decentralists and centralists, you have these two words, strict constructionism and loose constructionist, all right? Now, a strict constructionist is put under the decentralist or states' rights approach or belief or interpretation of the Constitution. So here's how you have to figure out this term, because it's going to come back, and I want to plant the seed now. Strict, the word I want you to think about is narrow. And then constructionist just simply means interpretation, all right? So a narrow interpretation of the Constitution, all right? And when you have a narrow interpretation of the Constitution, what that does is that's going to limit the power of the federal government. They're only going to have those powers that are clearly listed. That is a strict constructionist / narrow interpretation of the Constitution, all right? And remember that the states' rights, decentralists, anti-federalists, to go back to a little bit earlier in the unit, they believe that the 10th Amendment, the reserved powers, if it wasn't clearly listed before for the federal government, then the states have those reserved / another name for reserved powers are police powers, all right? Now, going to the centralist approach or the nationalist approach, you have a loose constructionist. So for loose, I want you to think of broad, and constructionist, again, I want you to think interpretation. So if you have a broad interpretation of the Constitution, what that's going to do is give the federal government more power, because what you do is you look at the Commerce Clause, you look at the Necessary and Proper Clause, you look at powers given to the federal government in this Constitution, and if you have a broad reading of those, you're going to be able, as the federal government, to justify actions that aren't clearly listed. Does that make sense? All right, so strict constructionist and loose constructionist. All right, so let's bump into, today we have pages 13, 14, and 15. And 13 is kind of a continuation of 12, this idea of federalism, all right? And at the beginning of 13, it talks about this idea of Nixon's new federalism. Remember that new federalism is a movement in the 70s in which government at the federal level is trying to give power back to the states, where, remember, from the New Deal until the mid-70s, the federal government's power grew tremendously at expense of the states. And therefore, there's this movement, beginning with Nixon, that there should be power should go back to the states. And that's what new federalism is, all right? In the 70s and then into the 80s with Ronald Reagan, all right? Now, the 1990s, all right, particularly 1994, the Republican Party takes back the House of Representatives for the first time in roughly 30 years. And that's a big deal, because if you control one branch of government, the House, you have power to dictate the powers of our government or how that power will be carried out. And what the 1994 New Federalist approach. This is what I want you to call it. We go New Federalism from, say, 75 until 1994. And then in 1994, in this idea of federalism, we get the concept of the Devolution Revolution. Now, the Devolution Revolution believes in the exact same things as New Federalism, power back to the states. But it's just a movement within that. And it starts with the 104th Congress, in which the Republicans take back that House. And they basically say, we're going to do a series of things, a series of actions, pass laws that will give power back to the states. And that's why when we get into this, look, they pass a series of laws. Look at this, the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. All right, a mandate is when the federal government passes a law and tells the state to do something. Examples of these are the Americans with Disabilities Act. The federal government said, we've passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, and what you need to do is follow these rules regarding the Americans with Disabilities Act, and states have to comply. You have the Clean Air, the Clean Water Acts. We have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. All right? And all of these were laws, mandates that said, states, we believe that you should do these things. All right? And so in the 1990s, with the Devolution Revolution, they believed that these mandates were too much federal power, not enough state power. And therefore, they passed, in 1995, the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. Now, if the federal government tells the states to do something and passes law and gives money for it, it's funded. If the federal government tells the states to do something and they don't appropriate money for it, it's unfunded. So essentially, the Republicans in the Devolution Revolution in the 90s wanted to limit unfunded mandates, and so they passed the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act. They also did something called block grants instead of categorical grants, which I'm going to get to in a minute. All right? They also passed the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. All right? And basically what it did is welfare at that point was controlled by the federal government, where the federal government said, here's welfare money, states, you must spend it in this way. All right? What the Welfare Reform Act in 1996 did is it essentially made it a state program rather than a federal program. And what would happen is the federal government would give money to the states, but it gave states the freedom to choose how to carry out that program and how to hand out welfare and, more importantly, how to get people off welfare ideally. All right? So, now one of the things you're bumping into is there were some strings attached to the block grants of the Welfare Reform Act. All right? And a string just simply means rules, things you have to do. All right? And so, one of the rules or strings that came with the Welfare Reform Act is people that get welfare had to work within 2 years. And you could not receive benefits for more than 5 years. All right? So those are strings. All right? Another action by the Devolution Revolution or the 90s Congresses is they repealed the 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. They allowed the states to choose this speed limit on state highways. All right? Now, here's another concept on the bottom of 13. The Supreme Court actions that are consistent with devolution. Now, devolution means to give power back to the states, right? So Supreme Court actions. The Supreme Court, which is a whole unit for us, simply though right now, the Supreme Court basically says when Congress passes a law, when the states pass a law, when the president takes an action, when states take an action, the Supreme Court's job is to decide what actions are constitutional or what actions violate the Constitution. So when those notes on the bottom of page 13 say actions consistent with devolution, it means the Supreme Court in the 90s, which is the Rehnquist Court, a conservative court that believed in the ideas of devolution or New Federalism, took action that gave power back to the states. So look at this. They struck down the Gun-Free School Zones Act. The Gun-Free School Zones Act was a law that basically was the federal government telling the states what to do with weapons. For simple right now, right? And what the court did is they said, you do not have that power to do that, and therefore that action is unconstitutional and that law is dead. Therefore, giving power back to the states. They struck down the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which essentially the federal government tried to tell the states that they had to do certain things regarding religion. And what the Supreme Court said is, no, you cannot do that by striking down, or strike down, another word for striking down, or another phrase, is to declare something unconstitutional, to mean that law is now dead. You cannot carry it out. It violates the Constitution. And so by striking down RFRA, the Gun-Free School Zones Act, it gave power back to the states. And the same thing with the Brady Act. All right, the Brady Act basically was, it required local law enforcement agencies to do background checks on gun buyers. It was the federal government telling the states to do something. All right, and what the court said is, that's unconstitutional. You don't have that power. We'll get into why later. All right, but the idea is, in the 90s, we have this devolution in which not only was Congress and the Republican Congresses, but the Supreme Court seemed to be behind this belief of sending power back to the states. All right? Here's some extra credit, though, on this really quickly. Gun-Free School Zones Act, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and the Brady Act. I want to know the 3 court cases that strike down those laws. What struck down the Gun-Free School Zones Act? What struck down the Religious Freedom Restoration Act? And what struck down the Brady Act? All right? They're court cases. All right? You find them, and I'll give you some extra credit. All right. Okay. Now let's move on to page 14. So again, this whole idea is federalism. All right. Now this idea of grants, federal grants. All right. The federal government giving states money. Right. Now you and I pay taxes. That money goes into the federal government. It pays for running the government, but also a lot of that stuff comes back to the states in the form of grants to build roads, to build schools, to do a variety of things. All right. And so the general idea is, grants allow the federal government to give states money to carry out certain things, all right? It allows states to get money that they need from the federal government, all right? It also, if you look on C in Roman numeral 2 on page 14, it says establishes minimum federal standards, right? So the federal government can say, here's money to clean the air, here's money to clean the water, here's money to do a variety of things, to build the roads, etc. And then what it does is it kind of allows the states to carry out those programs, all right? Now the other thing that it says in D there, it says it equalizes resources among the rich and poor states. California has something like the 7th largest economy in the world, where say a Mississippi or Arkansas does not, all right? And so where maybe California could generate its own income to deal with roads and schools and things like that, maybe Mississippi or Arkansas can't. And so federal grants, monies to the states, allows to create some consistency among our country of roads and schools and on and on and on, all right? Now, there's generally 4 types of grants, all right? And I want you to look at them in the idea of centralism or decentralism. Which of the grants gives power to the federal government? Which of the grants gives power to the state government? And by power, I generally think what we mean is, if the federal government says, here's the money, you must spend it this way, that's power. If the federal government says, here's some money, spend it how you see fit to fix your problems, that gives power back to the states, all right? And so we have categorical, project, block, and revenue sharing grants, all right? So to get rid of project and revenue sharing, all right, project grants are essentially where a state will say, we really need to do something. All right, and so they will write a grant, or by writing a grant I mean a proposal. And that proposal basically says, if we had X amount of dollars, this is what we would do. All right, and so the federal government will have this project grant money laying around. They'll go, wow, Nevada had a great idea, here's the money to do that. So you apply for those funds. All right. The other kind is a revenue sharing grant, and that's kind of funny because they don't exist at this moment, all right, as far as I know. Revenue sharing grant, when the federal government has money left over, meaning they bring in tax dollars and then they have more money left over than they've spent, which we are not doing that right now, they will give that money back to the states, and that gives freedom to the states to decide how to spend the money. So revenue sharing grants we associate with Nixon and New Federalism. When there were some budget surpluses, that money was immediately in Nixon's mind, should have been given back to the states, and it was, and they had absolute freedom to determine how to spend that money. All right? So revenue sharing grants, which don't exist at the moment because we have new revenue, give absolute power to the states to determine how and where to spend it. All right? The 2 we will generally focus on are categorical and block grants. All right? Categorical grants are monies from the federal government that says, right now, here's X amount of money. This is, if you accept this money, and states don't have to accept categorical grants. They're also called formula grants. If you accept this money, these are the things you must spend it on. They're very, 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 very specific. And And the federal government does this to get the states to do things that the federal government wants done. Right? Again, cleaning air, cleaning water, building roads, building military bases, etc. All right? Now, the analogy I like to use is your parents give you 20 bucks and they say, Stevie or Susie, go to the grocery store and here's a list of exactly what you must buy. All right? That's a categorical grant because it's telling you exactly how to spend the money and you must comply or you're in trouble. All right? Now again, the state doesn't have to take that money. All right? Now a block grant, more consistent with New Federalism and Devolution, Revolution, which gave the states, and going back to categorical, they don't really give the states any choice on how to spend the money. And therefore, if they don't give the states choice on how to spend the money, it goes back to the powers in the federal government's hands. All right? A block grant is a block grant. Let's use the analogy of the grocery store. Your parents say, here's $20, go get dinner. So you have to spend it on stuff for dinner, but you get to determine how to spend it on dinner. That's what a block grant does. It's a X amount of monies to the government or to the state, and it says here's money for education. States can determine, as long as they spend it in that broad area of education, the states get to choose. So if Nevada wanted to say, reduce classroom size, or Nevada wanted to increase the number of charter schools, as long as it's in education, they could spend that block grant money on that. And California could do other things. So it gives freedom back to the states on how to choose, even though there's some strings or parameters, boundaries, right? All right. So think about it. Categorical grants give power to the federal government because the federal government says you have to spend it this way. Block grants give power to the state governments because the federal government says here's money, as long as you fall within, law enforcement or education, whatever the issue the money is supposed to spend it or be spent on, you determine how to spend it. Again, giving some choice to the states how best to deal with their problems. All right? Okay, now look at the bottom of page 14. The Democrats have generally liked categorical grants because it's more strings in which the federal government is telling the states what to do. All right? Where Republicans have generally favored block grants, which is allowing the states to choose, all right? And next unit is all ideology, so we'll really flush out this, what's a D, what's an R, what's conservative, what's a liberal, all right? Okay, so now think about this. Welfare Reform Act again, 1996 Welfare Reform Act, all right? Look at this. On the bottom of page 14, it says it ended the entitlement status of welfare, all right? And what it basically did is it took welfare, which originally, before this law, the Welfare Reform Act, or the 1996 Personal Responsibility of Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, Welfare Reform Act, it changed it from a categorical grant to a block grant. So think about that. What that meant was, for welfare programs, the money now was, you have to spend it on welfare states, but with a few strings, that we listed before. But you spend it on welfare how you best see fit to best get, people off welfare, to help people, all right, to be most effective. And so look at some of the federal strings, because remember, it's a block grant, so it says there's fewer strings than a categorical grant, but not no strings. No federal funds can go to recipients who haven't worked in 2 years. No federal funds can go to recipients who have received the money for 5 years or more, or more than 5 years. All right? And you had to spend at least 75% of what you had previously spent on welfare, right? Because what they didn't want is they didn't want the states to go, oh, great, thanks for all this money for welfare, and then not spend it on welfare. So there were some strings with the Welfare Reform Act, but it's a good example of devolution and a good example of the use of block grants. All right? Okay. Now, let's move over to 15, all right, really quickly, and we'll wrap this lecture up, which is simply mandates, all right? A mandate is a federal order, okay? When I say federal government, I mean the national government, imposed upon the states. So the examples, the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act in the 70s, all right? The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, right? These were all laws passed by Congress that said, states, you must do this. Right? That is a mandate. Now, the idea is to meet the goal of the federal government, get more kids that maybe are special needs educated so they can, get into society differently. In the 70s, we literally had some of the great rivers in this country on fire from pollution. all right, to clean the water up, to stop coal plants, from billowing smoke directly into the air. They had to be clean coal plants, that kind of thing, right? So those are the goals by the federal government, and they told the states they must do this. Now, if it comes with money, that's a funded mandate. But if it comes with no money, it's an unfunded mandate, and that's no good. That's, your parents say, okay, Susie, Stevie, go get dinner. That's an unfunded mandate. They told you to do something, they didn't give you any money. All right? And so as you can imagine, states aren't going to love unfunded mandates. And that's why the Unfunded Mandates Reform Act was passed by those Republican Congresses in the Devolution Revolution. All right? So, well, that's it. I mean, you can look at some of the details in there, all right? Sometimes the states don't like the federal government telling them what to do. Sometimes they want them to tell them what to do. But generally, states are not going to like this idea of money coming, or no money coming, but an order coming, a mandate coming, all right? So, that's about it for the day, all right? That's to 15. We have one more page, so one more lecture. And what I'll do in the next lecture is I'll knock out page 16 really quickly, and then I'll do some review things, all right? Okay, hey, have a good day. I'll see you later.